From the Broken Wheel Cycle, Volume 1, Distant Dawn. The Clerk, a Warhammer 40,000 story. The cogitator started to hum, whine, and emit a stale ozone stink, its processor protesting the calculations Kael forced through the sticky and faded keyboard. The stink mixed with the poorly recycled air, stale recaf and soy beef hidden beneath Angral's desk, from which he would surreptitiously steal mouthfuls when he thought no one was looking. Not that anyone cared. Tap, hum, whine, stink. Tap, hum, whine, beef, stink. Still the figures wouldn't add up. Somebody somewhere had made a mistake. Somebody somewhere was in trouble. Kael just hoped it was not him. The Logisticum Veritatis was clear and indisputable, the self-verifying trail of transactions dutifully encoded by 100 hands in painful detail as the property of the Imperium traversed the rivers and rails of bureaucracy. But one of those many hands had erred, and it was written clearly in the numbers that regular consignments of RX-5 hex shells, whatever they were being incorrectly routed to Basport Minus, nearly an entire sector away from their intended destination. As a one-off, Kael might have simply appended a note in the Logisticum, pinned a misdirection notice to the appropriate ledger block. But this was a repeating error. Over time, it would breach accepted tolerance levels. Further action would be required. Kael looked across the bustling scriptorium at his supervisor Korvin. The older man, wearing his usual expression, battered and harried, frowned at one of the many data slates scattered across his desk. It was his habit to check the daily tally of corrections from his team. Kael's work always passed scrutiny, but Korvin had saved several of his colleagues from discipline notices on more than one occasion. The Administratum's official policy held individuals responsible for their own errors. Korvin was merely there to ensure targets were met. Yet, however commendable his actions were, they had cost him dearly in time and energy. A repeating error, spanning multiple ledger blocks. The correction writ would require clerks across the whole chain of transactions to issue their own misdirection notices. To get a writ of that size, issued would require Korvin's seal. Even when issued, Korvin would likely spend weeks dealing with vox calls and epistolary notices from other supervisors trying to avoid any notion of blame, sullying their own reputations. For a moment, Kael considered deleting his search records. Ignoring the error would be an act of kindness, sparing Korvin the inevitable fallout. But Kael understood something about himself that most people never learned. An astute observer might have noticed the pallid hue to his complexion, the way his eyes took a fraction longer to adjust to sudden increases in light, the perpetual tension in his shoulders, as if braced for sudden violence. That observer might have correctly guessed he originated from the substacks, those crumbling lower levels of the hive, packed with factories, refineries, foundries, where the unseen and unwanted of the city eked a short and precarious existence amongst the polluted, overcrowded foundations of the spires. His quiet bookishness had been a liability in that dark, noisy, violent place. It was there, hiding from the gangers, grifters, and stimmers, that he found an affinity with numbers. A solace. Eventually, a minor scholarship from the Administratum offered him a way up hive as an apprentice data scribe. Kael had grasped that opportunity with the desperation of a drowning man. He had completed his apprenticeship and clawed his way out of the dark. Numbers had saved him. They were solid, immutable, honest. They deserved to be heard. Kael sighed and stood up. He would not ignore this error. He could not. Maris looked up from his desk and saw Kael walking towards him. As always, it reminded him of the small birds that would gather for leftover breadcrumbs. Tame enough to come for the food, but skittish, ready to take wing and flee at the slightest threat, imagined or real. He bore no ill will to the slight youngster. His work was solid, and he did more than his fair share. If Maris had to place Kael in his personal ledger, it would be under the column mostly harmless, but not quite in the work-friend one. He walked to Maris's desk. "The artillery routing," Kael said quietly. "Third Vulpines. Can you look at something?" Maris looked up, momentarily confused that the little bird had spoken. It was unusual for Kael to say much beyond the mild pleasantries that office etiquette demanded. Not that Maris minded, if anything he valued not being drawn into the minutiae of Kael's life. "Look, Kael, I'm a bit busy at the moment. Is there no one else you can ask?" Maris looked round the office, trying to catch someone else's eyes, but Morwen and Poldierk studiously ignored their exchange, and Angral, as per usual, seemed preoccupied, trying to stuff soy beef into his mouth without being seen. Kael turned to go, but at the last minute stopped and turned back to face Maris. "Maris, I know you're busy, and I don't want to interrupt, but I need to get Korvin to issue a correction writ, and he's so busy I—" Kael paused, as if surprised the extra words had come out of his mouth. Maris had to stop himself from smiling as the image of the timid little bird once again flitted into his mind. "A correction writ, eh?" boomed a voice from behind. Kael turned in alarm, and for a moment Maris wondered if the little bird would finally take flight. Unbeknownst to Kael, Korvin had entered the office and stood behind him. Korvin was almost the complete opposite to Kael in every respect. Where Kael was slight and timid, Korvin was large, nearly 6 feet 6 inches, broad-chested, incapable of speaking below a roar. He was one of the longest-serving members of Korvin's staff, unofficially his second-in-command, sometimes standing in for him when the labyrinthine bureaucracy demanded his presence elsewhere. "You know how much work that'll be for Korvin," Korvin said. His tone was matter-of-fact, not unkind. "Just stating a fact." Kael seemed to grow a little smaller, drawing into himself. Maris, perhaps a little guilty now at his earlier rebuttal, turned to Korvin. He said something about artillery routing. Kid normally knows his stuff. Korvin looked at the two of them, shook his head, and held his hand out for the data slate that Kael was clutching. "Okay, Kael, show me what you've got." Hoisting himself to the edge of Maris's desk, Korvin began to scan the proffered data slate, whilst Maris strained to look over his shoulder. It took longer than Kael expected, and after a few minutes, Morwena joined to peer over Korvin's shoulder at Kael's data slate. Finally, Korvin put down the data slate. He looked at the faces gathered around him, for once unusually silent. Taking a deep breath, he looked directly at Kael. "This isn't just one error, Kael. This is... If this gets flagged, it goes higher than Korvin. It goes to the audit committee. Korvin won't just have weeks of Vox calls, he'll have an investigation." The panic on Kael was immediate, his face pale, eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape. "Aye, Kael," continued Korvin, "you've done well to identify this, but it's just the beginning. Korvin takes this to the audit committee and they tear this office apart. They'll audit all our work, every one of us." The room went very quiet. Kael's face had gone from pale to ashen. I didn't think—" "No," said Korvin, not unkindly, "you didn't. But that's all right. That's why we're here." He looked at each of them in turn, Maris, Morwena, Angral, who had finally stopped chewing, Poldierk, and the others gathered now around the desk. "The question isn't whether Kael's right, he is. The question is, are we ready for what comes next?" No one answered immediately. The weight of it hung in the air between them. Finally, Maris spoke. "If we don't flag it, someone else will eventually. And then it looks like we were covering it up." "Aye," said Korvin, "there's that too." Poldierk leaned against the desk. "So we do this. We prepare it properly. We make it airtight. We give Korvin the best possible hand we can. And we stand with him when the auditors come," added Morwena quietly. Korvin nodded. "That's the choice then. We do this together, or we don't do it at all." One by one, they nodded. That night, they worked late. Kael gathered the data. Maris verified every figure. Morwena cross-referenced against the Logisticum Veritatis. Korvin organized it all into a dossier that was so clean, so methodical, so obviously correct that no auditor could find fault with their work. By dawn, they had something beautiful in its precision. A correction writ so clear, so undeniable, that Korvin would have no choice but to sign it. When they brought it to him that morning, Korvin understood immediately what it meant. His hands shook slightly as he reviewed it. He looked at each of them, his team, standing in his office, and something passed between them that didn't need words. He signed it. The Vox calls came within hours. First, the auditors. Dry, punctilious men, whispering threats, demanding records, insinuating themselves into the office, into everyone's desks, into their drawers, their files. Then the supervisors and clerks, outraged, apologetic, terrified, pleading, the whole gamut of emotions flooding in like a tide. Korvin stood firm against the auditors, these second-rate inquisitors that fought numbers and papers rather than Xenos and heretics. But he did not stand alone. Maris fielded the incoming vox calls, calm and methodical, sometimes by patience, sometimes by guile, sometimes an old favor called in, sometimes a veiled threat. Either way, the result was the same. No call ended with any wrongdoing pinned to Korvin's team. Morwena organized the records, creating a timeline so clear that even the auditors couldn't deny it. Poldiak stayed late, helping Korvin prepare responses to the epistolary notices that arrived daily, each one another supervisor trying to distance themselves from the error. Corden stood in the doorway most nights, a silent presence, making sure Korvin ate, making sure he didn't drown completely in the weight of it. And Kael? Kael verified every single number again, 3 times, 4 times, making sure there were no mistakes, no ammunition for the auditors to use. They were a team holding a man up, and a man holding a team up in return. It lasted 3 weeks. By the end, Korvin had lost weight. Maris's voice had gone hoarse from vox calls. Morwena's hands shook when she held her stylus. Poldiak had dark circles under his eyes that wouldn't fade. Corden's usual roar had become a weary murmur. But they held. They didn't break. The memo came down on a Tuesday morning. Office reorganization for optimal efficiency. What it meant was clear to everyone. Punishment. Dispersal. The team that had stood together would be scattered. Kael was reassigned to the 3rd Sector Logistics Office, a place of rigid hierarchy and cold protocol where clerks didn't speak unless spoken to. He sat at his desk on the first day, surrounded by silence and formality, and missed the smell of stale recaf and soy beef. Maris found himself in the upper hive administrative bureau, all gilt edges and political maneuvering, where every word was carefully weighed, every gesture calculated. He lasted 3 days before realizing he was drowning in a different kind of bureaucracy, one where merit meant nothing and connections meant everything. Morwena was sent to the munitions allocation office, a place where every decision was scrutinized, where mistakes were punished swiftly and without mercy. She worked longer hours than she ever had before, and no one thanked her for it. Poldiak ended up in hive records management, endless filing, endless cataloging, endless repetition. The work was simple. The isolation was crushing. Corden was the cruelest assignment of all. Reassigned to the oversight committee itself, made part of the machinery that audited offices like the one he'd just left, forced to become the very thing he'd stood against. And Korvin remained, but diminished, transferred to a smaller office, a smaller team, a smaller scope. The message was clear: you did the right thing, this is what it costs. The message came through Angral, of all people. A simple vox note to each of them: the broken wheel, tomorrow night, don't be late. It was an old bar in the lower hive spire levels, the kind of place where the workers went, where no one asked questions, where a group of scattered bureaucrats could sit without drawing attention. Kael arrived first, nervous as always. Then Maris, looking older than he had 2 months ago. Morwena came in quietly, not meeting anyone's eyes. Poldiak looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Corden filled the doorway like a storm cloud finally breaking. And Korvin. Korvin sat at the corner table, a drink already in front of him, waiting. No one said much at first. They just sat there, the 6 of them, 7 with Angral, around a table in a bar that didn't care who they were or what they'd done. Finally, Korvin raised his glass. To numbers, he said quietly. To numbers, they echoed.